Just to get a sense of my audience, because there's not many of us, we can be more interactive. Can I have a sense of how many of you are in gender studies? Middle East studies? Okay. Oh, that's important, because we sort of tend to speak to each other, and that doesn't always work, so it's very useful for me to know where you're coming from. Well, I'm really pleased to be here and to be with you, jet lag notwithstanding. So what I'll try to do is try to explain to you what it is we were trying to do with really two books that are separated by the span of an entire generation. And the question that comes to mind, you know, when you've written a book more than 25, or you've put together a book more than 25 years ago, and then you purport to revisit it, is why and why now? These are the obvious questions. And in some ways, I would say that the leading drive behind the project isn't all that different, because in both cases, what we were trying to do at different periods was to interrogate some of the key conceptual categories that dominated analyses of the politics of gender in the Muslim majority countries and Muslim diasporas. So if you like, the enterprise is not all that different. In both cases, in the case of Women, Islam and the States, and in the case of this new book, Gender, Governance and Islam, we've been witness to epochal changes that required a shift in perspective, if not in paradigm, okay? Now, the first volume corresponded to a period of post-colonial nation building, where developmental states, or states with developmental pretensions, were defining modernization and national development in new ways that included women as citizens. And the book itself was an attempt to systematically bring in the role of the state and the vagaries of very different nation-building projects that presented us with very different articulations between nationalisms, Islam, and women's rights. And what followed was a period of quite vigorous post-colonial critique, interrogating the categories of modernization, national development, and so on, in which I myself modestly participated. At first with enthusiasm, but eventually with more skepticism, as you will see. Now, the new book, Gender, Governance and Islam, aims to evaluate the changes, which I literally consider seismic changes. The tectonic plates have shifted, and all the terms of the original debate, women, the state, Islam, have been modified beyond recognitions. The changes have involved shifts in the terms of feminist theory itself, the eclipse of the state in the face of new types of both supranational and subnational governance, and what is known now as the deterritorialization of Islam and the geopolitics around Islam. Now, I do not propose to rehearse the ways in which the terms of reference of feminist theory have shifted from women to gender, especially to those of you who are not familiar with the field. I am just going to introduce a caveat on the case studies that are included in this volume. And in my chapter on Turkey in that book, I opted for the term gender activism rather than women's movements or women's rights activism, because I am aware that there is a broader register of collective action encompassing all types of mobilization around gender, including gays, transsexuals, queer politics, etc. However, in this volume, certainly in the Turkey chapter, I limited myself to women's gender activism, but I was fully aware that I was dealing with a subset of issues within a much, much broader political field. And this is the case to varying degree for most of the authors, both because of their research interests, but also at the same time because these rights platforms continued to be extremely marginalized and under great threat. But there are degrees in that because, you know, the Pakistan chapter touches upon sexual liberties movements. The Egypt chapter talks about masculinities in Egypt and so on. Now, this is for gender. In the realm of governance, the re-articulations between states and societies ushered in by neoliberal transformations since the 90s and the geopolitical convulsions following the armed interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq after the 9/11 events in this country, basically dismantled regional regimes and created a myriad of so-called weak states or quasi-states where states now lack control over large swathes of their territories and have to cohabit with non-state actors, which are sometimes as powerful as so-called central authorities, as was the case and is still the case with the Taliban in Afghanistan, ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and so forth. This, of course, created ideal circumstances for external interference and regional interference. As a result of this, the boundaries between the subnational, the national, and transnational levels have become totally porous, much more so than when the original text was published. And you will hear from Catherine later on, who's going to talk about transnational Islamic politics. Now, the long-term legitimacy crises that have been created by these re-articulations have led to the revival of grassroots Islamist movements and top-down efforts to both placate and contain these movements, both in the Arab region and beyond, finally leading us to the upheavals of the Arab uprisings and their continuing aftermath. So this is the context we're dealing with. And when we look at this context and we look at the academic literature, we see that there is an enduring preoccupation with the geopolitics of imperialism and its perverse effects on struggles for gender equality regimes. And this, of course, took a special importance after 9/11, where you had literally armed interventions where women's rights were put on the agenda as one of the causes for the intervention, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And in a lot of northern feminist circles, the equation between feminism and imperialism became ever tighter. And there was a revival of the original debate of the colonial origins of women's rights movements in the Middle East and beyond. Now, the inroads that global gender equality regimes that are upheld by the United Nations and the specialist agencies and donor-assisted rights platforms, also being propagated by donor-assisted NGOs in these countries, have, I think, been greatly played up in the literature. They loom very large. Also because they're much easier to study in the sense that the literature is out there, it's public documents, there is more accountability in the sense and public exposure. In this volume, however, what we attempt to show is that ultimately it's internal struggles over control, identity, and legitimacy that play a decisive role in setting the terms of the politics of gender, of course set against a background of varying types of global entanglements. Now, we tried to demonstrate that by using a continuum of cases. Fragmented societies that are in the grip of ongoing conflicts, such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine. And these, of course, are countries in which there are more direct interventions by global governance institutions. I mean, the Palestinian budget goes through the Quartet, the Afghan state is utterly dependent on external aid, and likewise, the Iraqi reconstruction that Nadia told us a lot about is similar. However, we also have the case of Pakistan, which was also involved in the war on terror with very important consequences for rights platforms. Turkey and Egypt that have lived through popular arrest and regime change, and Saudi Arabia and Iran that have undergone major transformations despite a deceptive appearance of regime continuity. So these are our case studies. And of course, as you can see, they vary a great deal along that axis. But that makes it, that's the advantage, I guess, of comparative methods. It makes it possible to highlight which variables come into play where. Now, what all these chapters have in common is an analysis of the efforts deployed by power holders to enforce gender hierarchies and to uphold male entitlements, on the one hand, and on the other, diverse patterns of grassroots resistance, which may be followed by periodic accommodations by power holders and resistance in other cases. So in each case, there are instances of resistance to existing regimes. Examples of grassroots resistance range from individual acts of rebellion, such as Saudi women fleeing the strictures of the male guardianship system, who have become, by the way, a diplomatic headache because, you know, they show up in countries like Canada, who refuses to return them. They become a kind of diplomatic embarrassment. So I think they're sort of slightly relaxing the male guardianship system, which isn't working, evidently. Again, you know, individual acts like iconoclastic protests of online activists in Pakistan, most unexpectedly in this realm of sexual liberties, which came as a surprise to me. And of course, collective dissent that we see on the streets of Istanbul, Cairo, Tehran, and now much further afield. And I think that what we have glimpsed through expressions of dissent and through contentious politics is that an unprecedented level of social polarization pits those who acquiesce and uphold authoritarian rule and strongman regimes against women and men who recognize aspirations to gender equality as part and parcel of a package for demands for democratic governance, okay? So what I am putting forward, and this is debatable, is that now we are living through a rather unique moment where it has become perfectly credible to talk about budding cross-gender alliances around anti-authoritarian politics versus what I call, and that is also debatable, but we'll do that in the questions, what I call a politics of masculinist restoration. What I mean by masculinist restoration is a situation where entrenched male privileges are no longer secure, where patriarchy, however defined, is no longer hegemonic. So for those of you who have read and are familiar with the work of Bourdieu, it's the difference between doxa, where patriarchy is an unquestioned do fish know they're living in water situation, to orthodoxy, where in order to enforce that order, you have to expend a great deal more energy, ideologically and institutionally. And of course, more coercion. So you can have outbreaks of gender-based violence. And what I'm saying basically is that these manifestations of gender-based violence are not manifestations of patriarchy, but rather of the fact that it is crumbling and now has to be enforced coercively, basically. either on street level, for those of you who are familiar with the femicides in Ciudad Juárez in Mexico, or the gang rapes of women in Soweto in South Africa, or the woman who was molested on the bus and killed in New Delhi, the numerous examples of, women in Istanbul, in various cities being molested, men getting away practically scot-free. This is the politics of masculinist restoration. Now, as I was mulling over those thoughts about patriarchy, yes, that's my conclusion. I'll take 2 minutes over it. As I was mulling over these thoughts, we were overtaken by history, because so much academic writing and critique is premised on a hegemonic, immutable, liberal order in the West. And here we were, hearing speeches from Trump, which I shall not quote, about grabbing certain parts of the anatomy. We had Duterte talking about, oh, I wish I had raped that nun. We had Bolsonaro, Salvini, the heartland of Western liberalism, Europe. We had a rising illiberal right-wing populism reinstating rigid gender and racial hierarchies. And this, of course, is a politics that lies at the heart of this conservatism, and this has become truly global. I therefore conclude, in my remaining 10 seconds, that this is a uniquely productive moment to de-orientalize scholarship on gender in Muslim societies and to break the shackles of lingering binaries such as tradition, modernity, Islam, secularism, imperialism versus national authenticity. Time to scrap them all and call a moratorium on their use a different language. It is time to finally situate the politics of gender where it belongs, at the front lines of democratic struggles everywhere. Thank you. The younger colleagues can stand. Oh, yes, I'm coming.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm so happy to be able to host Denise and Catherine here. Some of you might know, but some of you don't, that Denise was, of course, my PhD supervisor. And we say that, as academics, those of us who are interested in knowledge, we stay students all our lives. But it was very obvious to me that after 20 years of having obtained my PhD under Denise, writing a book with her, I definitely became a student again. As Denise pointed out, one central argument of our book is that the struggle for political power, women's bodies, but also increasingly men's bodies and men's sexualities is central to existing regimes' attempts to maintain their control and authority. So that's a very central argument. But at the same time, we are arguing that the resistance to authoritarian regimes, and this is whether the resistance is Islamist or secular, and the struggle for greater democracy and human rights, these struggles are increasingly bound up with demands for gender-based rights and justice. And this crucially presents shifts from the discourses and practices of earlier social and political movements in the region and elsewhere that promised women their rights and address their demands once the wider issues would be addressed. So this is really a change now. So in the past, it was whether it was in relation to independence, liberation from occupation, or freedom from economic exploitation. Let's deal with those issues first, and then we address gender-based rights and justice. As Denise pointed out, since we wrote and published the book, there have been monumental changes and developments in the region. So I'm just going to point to a few. Recently, we actually had a fantastic event here where Nada Mustafa spoke about the important role of women in the uprisings in the Sudan. And that, of course, against the historical background of women's mobilization against authoritarian politics in the Sudan. So we don't know, it's still early days, we don't know what is going to unfold in the Sudanese context, but it looks right now as it is one of the more hopeful contexts. I would also like to mention Lebanon. I assume many of you have been following the news. So in the Lebanese context, we have seen that women actually have been these last weeks at the forefront of literally building sort of protective walls between the police, the security forces, and protesters. And women of all generations, of all sects, of all social classes have been involved. And although, generally speaking, the protests which are against political corruption, against sectarianism, against the lack of services, lack of jobs, and so on, have been relatively sort of peaceful, certainly if we compare it to Iraq, but there has been violence and women have been involved in some of these violent outbursts. And I actually had some friends call me last week and they had to take some friends to the hospital because they had been beaten up by militia. But I guess myself and those of us who know about Lebanon, we were not so surprised that women were involved in the protest. I mean, there's of course a long history of women's involvement in trade unions and political parties and so on, but also women are very much out there in the public sphere. I'd like to take a moment to now recognize, though, what I find much more astonishing in many ways is the fact that in the Iraqi context, where we also have protests, much more violent. Only today, actually, 4 protesters were shot dead, and there are several hundred protesters who have been shot by live ammunition. That even in that context of, kind of a violent crackdown at the hands of the security forces, and also in a context where women were not that much visible in public spaces, they are very much, part of the developments and are out on the street, and again, cutting across generation, younger women, older women, cutting across ethnic and religious backgrounds, secular, religious, and so on. And I just wanted to share with you sort of a few images. So this is, of course, all this happened after we published the book, but all this in many ways illustrates some of the points that we actually develop in the book, the centrality of women and gendered claims for these wider political movements. So just a few pictures, and there's one iconic picture that I wanted to share. No, I'm not sharing it. So another development that, of course, has been unfolding in recent weeks, and we had a teach-in last week, is the Turkish invasion of northern Syria. And I was struck in the very beginning of the invasion that Erdogan stated in a press context, stated to the media that the military operation against Kurds in northern and eastern Syria was a fight against what he called women's terrorism. And here it became very clear that his and the chapter that Denise contributed to the volume looks precisely at his rhetoric and the policies towards women and gender inside Turkey. But, by saying that he's fighting women's terrorism, he was also making a point about the threat of, a kind of utopian society and a movement that actually puts gender-based rights and gender-based justice at its center. So that is not something that, Erdogan clearly feels comfortable with. But as Denise pointed out, it is also clearly not something that President Trump would feel comfortable with. So since 2011, in the context of the rapid political transformations that we've seen across the region, women's and men's bodies and sexualities have emerged as key sites of contestation and control. And Denise already reflected a little bit on the shifts in terms of scholarship, and I just wanted to add a little bit to that. So I remember when I was a PhD student in the 90s, and I would go to conferences and I would speak about, I mean, at the time I worked on the Egyptian women's movement. Later on, I worked on the impact of the Ba'ath regime and also the invasion and occupation on women and gender in Iraq. And I would be part of a women-only panel, often referred to as the ladies' panel. And then there would be sort of other panels would address, the big issues such as civil society and democracy and social transformation or political sectarianism. And these were all male colleagues. I mean, this was, very neatly divided. And us from the ladies' panel would consistently actually go to the panel where the big issues were discussed and would listen carefully and then would intervene by saying, yes, but where is the gender analysis? Where is the feminist analysis? And, depending on the scholar, they would sort of recognize that maybe it was a blind spot, but they wouldn't come to our panels, okay? But that has changed. It has changed in the ways that I think panels focusing on gender are much more mixed. We have more men actually being interested in certainly men and masculinities, but also queer studies. But also in terms of audience, I find that my male colleagues are recognizing much more that a gendered analysis is actually key to understanding the big issues. And so I think that is really important to keep in mind that there has been a shift. Now, as I said that, and Denise also mentioned that the apparent increase in violence against women by agents of the state or by hired thugs is often a counter-revolutionary strategy to break the will of movements calling for political change or for social change. Now, we know that in Syria, rape has been used by government forces and by pro-government militia as a weapon to break the opposition and civilian support for it. Now, in Egypt, this is a picture of Egypt, women, and more specifically the female body, have occupied center stage in the struggle against patriarchal authority and have been caught up in the developments that Denise referred to as masculinist restoration. Now, what often gets overlooked and what is really at the center of our edited volume is that the most significant drivers of the politics of gender in very concrete societal settings inevitably reflect the very complex interaction of state, non-state, and popular actors. And so, for instance, Heba El-Khouli and Nadia Taher, who are contributing with a chapter on Egypt, they analyze the very ways in which the politics of gender has become central to ruptures and contestations during the turbulent post-Mubarak period in Egypt. And in the attempt to establish legitimacy and gain control, President al-Sisi, al-Azhar, and even the Salafist, which is the very sort of conservative Sunni Islamists, have been competing over their respective interpretations of Islam in their bargaining of women's rights. And the chapter on Egypt also illustrates clearly the way that the backlash against the popular resistance to state authoritarianism took the form of the politics of masculinist restoration that Denise mentioned. So I'm now going to sort of shift a bit in terms of my focus and just to mention that one of the chapters mentioned is based on Iran, and sort of the case study there, I think it's quite interesting to share. It's that of female-only parks, and a situation where we have this sort of perception of the Islamist Republic of Iran as all powerful in terms of imposing gender norms and relations, but here women actually use discourses around medical well-being, health, and also actually fitness to push the state to allow for women-only parks so that women were able to engage in sports and exercises. And this case study sort of illustrates that there's much more negotiation actually going on between the state and society, and certainly in terms of women's agency, and it's much less sort of linear as we often think, even in the context of the Islamist Republic. But moving to Iraq, and so my chapter is focusing on the Iraqi context. So my work has increasingly sort of interrogated the impetus to mainly focus or only focus on US imperialism when trying to explain what's been happening in Iraq. I mean, clearly, you know, when I first started out in the post-2003 invasion period, it would have been absurd for me not to stress the impact of the invasion and the occupation on women and gender relations in Iraq. I mean, clearly that was the very important context. But even at the time, I felt that it was also significant to historicize and look at the 35 years of Ba'ath regime and how that period, you know, had sort of different phases of that period impacted on women. But I have to say now we are in 2019, I get a bit impatient with the ongoing tendency among some of my colleagues to only mention the occupation and US imperialism in explaining developments in Iraq. So, you know, what my work does is sort of stresses the importance of local, regional, and transnational actors, which include militia, the various sectarian political parties, corrupt politicians, tribal leaders, criminal gangs, and even families in very much shaping gender norms and relations. And I think on this note, I'm going to stop. Well, this is okay. So in Baghdad, there's a sort of long tradition of visual art, and the University of Baghdad has a very strong art school, and this was one of the paintings that was produced by young Iraqi women, and it won a prize. And it's sort of, I guess I illustrate this picture because it sort of shows the various sort of forces that impinge on women's life. So there are sort of soldiers, but there are also sort of tribal leaders and the family.
Great, thank you very much, Nadia. I'd like to thank Brown University, Barbara and Soraya, and the Institute for welcoming us here. And I'm delighted Nadia's here because we used to be close to each other in London, and then I moved to New York, and now she's come here, which is wonderful that she's just a train ride away, which is great. And I want to thank all of the authors in this volume who have been wonderful to work with, and I think we've all learned so much from each other. It's been really a great process. And a very dear thanks to Denise. So Denise, she's been my role model, my mentor, and it's become a very dear friend over the years. I first met Denise in 1991 in London when I was her student, and that's a significant year because it's the year that Women, Islam, and the State was published. And I have to say that over the years, my work has mainly focused on how religion and culture in its various forms and practices travels through migration, through settlement, and then across generations. Methodologically, it's largely ethnographic, and so I spend a lot of time in homes, in kitchens, around dining room tables, in makeshift community centers, streets, cafes, shopping malls, just various locations. And these spaces are often seen as private, seemingly private, although I think they're not. This public-private divide is problematic. They're often seen as informal spaces, and they're often deemed as theoretically insignificant spaces. And so I have a lot of problems with that. And I think through Denise's help, her work and has really taught me how to link these ethnographic contexts to macro structures. And although her volume, Women, Islam, and the State, didn't focus on diasporic settings, it was hugely significant to show us how to push women's spaces, women's roles, and women's rights into the analytical frame, so to become center stage. So thank you, for that. Now, as already highlighted by Denise and Nadia, since its publication of Women, Islam, and the State, transnational networks, geopolitical entanglements, and diasporic activities and online activities have all become significant in informing women, gender politics, and gender activism. Now, all of the chapters in the volume engage with transnational dimensions, which in turn feed into my chapter, which is the last chapter of the book, and where I focus on the so-called Muslim diaspora and the politics that surround Islam and Muslims in Western contexts. So what I thought I'd do is just give you just a brief overview of the structure of the chapter and some of its arguments. So the chapter is really divided in two parts. So part one focuses on the making of a so-called Muslim diaspora and gender constructions in its making. So it argues that gender roles, gender relations, and bodily practices have become key ingredients in marking the boundaries between us and them in Western reifications of Islam, as well as marking differences within and between Muslim subgroupings and Islamic movements. So then part two of the chapter looks inside, sort of dives inside the so-called Muslim diaspora and highlights the divergent ways that people have navigated and challenged the pervasive gender ideologies, stereotypes, and collective representations. So despite the great heterogeneity of Muslims living in Western countries, with diverse demographic profiles, orientations, experiences, there's been an increasing prioritization of Muslim self and group identification on the one hand, and totalizing Muslims in single cultural and political blocs on the other. So homogenizing and profiling Muslims in Western countries is often linked to the post-9/11 geopolitical context. But the chapter takes a step back to show how these trends were happening well before 9/11. So prior to 9/11, I sort of crunched a lot of sociological and anthropological research into three interrelated explanations for the ascendancy of Muslim self and group identification. So first, I looked at the politics surrounding the recognition of Islam and Muslim practices in Western liberal state structures. Second, I look at the so-called global Islamic or Muslim awakening in its various manifestations, including the rise of Islamic transnational movements. And third, I look at responses to points 1 and 2. So responses to Muslim identity politics and Islamic movements, and then the rise of Islamophobia. So for example, on the first point, I looked at the emergence of Muslim umbrella groups that aim to lobby for accommodation of Islam and Muslim practice within national frameworks. So although countries vary greatly, depending on their particular histories, political and legal frameworks, commitments to secularism, what they have mainly in common is the unrepresentative nature of Muslim leadership and authority. So, which Muslims from what backgrounds should represent an assumed Muslim community? Whose Islamic theological school and gender norms should serve as exemplar for all? So in many cases, it was older, self-appointed male community brokers, largely from religiously conservative backgrounds, who fill these positions, these sort of gatekeeper positions. Now, as a result, matters that pertain to women in the family, which I should add, were matters that many grassroots women's groups were already actively working on, were grossly neglected. And this is ironic, considering that women's dress and the question of violence against women, which were often collapsed into a clumsy one category, were at the core of public debates on Muslim immigration and integration. Now, there's no time, but the chapter also discusses neoliberal policy under the name of austerity, which have also masked ways that women have been marking their political trajectories and setting their own agendas. And that's a different story. Now, the way that Islam has been institutionalized in Western states must also be viewed in relation to this so-called global Muslim awakening and the rise of Islamic transnational movements. Now, the Muslim awakening, which is highly diverse, has been understood to stem from different sources. So, including the long-term effects of the Iranian Revolution and the Shia revival, and then you have the effects of international missions exporting Salafi teachings through mosques and schools backed by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, and a wide array of other forms of Muslim movements, which I don't have time to go into. But these movements cover a very wide spectrum, from peaceful, pious, quietist movements to very active militant groups. Now, these various currents have been very adept at using the internet and social media to carry various and widely different interpretations of Islamic doctrines, ideologies, and symbols, particularly among the younger generations. So disciplining the mind, body, and conduct have been central to Islamist trends and often conveyed through heightened religious awareness, practice, and visibility of Islamic dress and symbols, and really showing the difference between us and them. So good Muslim in this thinking are submissive and pure, and bad Muslims are impure with loose morals. Okay, so the third shift has focused on Western responses to Muslim identity politics and these various and very different Islamic movements. So in the 1990s in particular, we started to see the reactionary othering and various strands of Islamophobia. So for instance, in addition to racists and bigots, which are quite clear that they just are anti-Islam, you started to also have liberal and leftists who are historically anti-racist, also beginning to question the compatibility of Western and Islamic principles. So perceptions that Muslim posed a threat to Western values, particularly women's equality and LGBTQ rights, were at the heart of public debates. And this was greatly exacerbated with the 9/11 attacks masterminded by Al-Qaeda. So all of this was pre-9/11. So the shock of 9/11, the war on terror and its devastating effects, and a new culture of unprecedented security measures in Western countries is all too familiar. Then additional terrorist attacks on Western soil, the rise of ISIS and anti-Western jihadi networks spurred further backlash against lax multicultural policies in the name of a new realism. The success of ISIS in recruiting Western-born men and women to serve in Syria, Iraq, and Libya further justified policy changes. So these conditions prompted many Western states to redefine citizenship rights and regulate cultural values that mark national borders. So women's issues, particularly dress, emerged as a central trope in shaping the boundaries of citizenship, legislation, and new forms of nationalism. So I looked in the chapter at various citizenship tests in various countries and citizenship courses and it showed how they try to distinguish the good, secular-minded Muslim from the bad, especially in relation to gender and sexuality norms. Now, in more recent years, converging populism, which is something that Denise brought up, which is clearly exemplified by Brexit, Trump, and the rise of the far right, have further locked Muslims into a single identity space. So Trump's chaotic regime of rule exercised through executive orders and anti-Muslim tweets and just dismantling of customary due process further feeds the so-called culture war. So as we're seeing, and we're really seeing this now with the rise of the far right and the violence of the far right and the white terrorism that is happening in various places around the world. So constructions of the Muslim man and Muslim women have consistently been used both by anti-Muslim groups and Islamist groups to define antagonistic group identities and protect dominant gender ideologies. So these measures and countermeasures have created their own noxious dynamics. Missing, of course, are Muslim voices many Muslim voices. And so part 2 of the book looks inside the so-called Muslim diaspora. So drawing upon my ethnographic research, I show how people contend with the multiple dynamics of Islamophobia, male-dominated Muslim identity politics, and the challenges posed by male-centered gender regimes and power bases in host and home countries. So while mindful of the volatile political and social environment and the trend to totalize Muslims in opposition to Western nation states, I've tried to shed light on the complex social and political transformations of a specific population and the varying ways that they've responded to the complicated politics that surround them. So, for example, my ethnography on 12 Shia Muslims in the UK showed how the politicized discursive terrains have deepened communal divisions and impacted gender politics within diaspora communities. So, although women continue to be deployed as markers of tradition and culture, there is an acute awareness of the social and political hurdles that Muslim women and men face in Western societies. Women have long created and employed a wide range of tools, platforms, and strategies to challenge gender ideologies and inequalities in their home countries, whether it's here or their countries of descent. And they do so from very diverse political and religious standpoints. Transnational feminist networks, for instance, have created many spaces for women to organize and reinforce advocacy work and campaigns across borders and other social barriers. Now, the effectiveness of women's transnational mobilization, however, depends on the capability to involve women and men at the grassroots, in the seemingly informal spaces, and to understand the changing factors that affect daily lives. So ultimately, with the salience of negativity surrounding Islam, it is all the more vital to amplify local struggles and very creative ways, both in informal places and also on the streets through dissent, really creative ways that women and men are transcending homogenized gendered representations of the so-called Muslim diaspora and assert a more nuanced vision of their diversity. Okay, thank you.
So we can open up to discussion, and I think you can all take the questions as they come.
Thank you, and thank you for the very interesting different aspects of the same issue. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the gender-based violence and the way that you see it. And you both mentioned that it is on the rise, and Nadia, you mentioned it as a strategy of breaking the wheel, so something that is consciously violent, whereas you, Denise, saw it as a response to resistance, right, in the move from doxa to heterodoxy. And I was wondering about that in the sense that I think we can all agree that rape, for example, or other forms of violence against women is not about sex, it's about power. But how or when this power is exercised, I wonder if it's about resistance to the collapse or diminishing of patriarchy, or something else is going on. For example, the fact that it always existed, but now we have the names and the tools to call it and claim it and talk about it. I just was wondering if you really do see an increase in violence against women, and what is the explanation that you want to give to it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's not just a question of gender-based violence, because there are instances where these can be seen clearly as political violence. I mean, when it's perpetrated by forces of the state, beating people up on Tahrir Square having organized groups of men harassing women in very systematic ways, it's a deterrent to mobilization, basically, by using women and so on. In other instances where it's bottom-up, individual men in buses beating up women in Turkey, that is a different sort of mechanism. But what I'm saying, which I haven't said today, is that there is a deep crisis in the gender order and a deep polarization which has made the discourse more violent. And how do you explain the manosphere in the United States? Have you been there? It's a very frightening space. You have a bunch of American men calling for various atrocities being perpetrated on women, and we're not talking about just the incels. For those of you who are not familiar, this is the involuntary celibates who suddenly walk into and start shooting everyone down because they're entitled to sex. They're not having it. But have you visited these websites lately? It is. I'm not a. Oh yeah, you should. Google Manosphere, Google 4chan, 5chan, the Reddit, lots. So these are men talking to each other about how women have gone too far, the world is going to pot because of feminists. They have to be brought to heel and put in their places, preferably through rape. Kill the bitch, rape the bitch. I mean, I'm quoting. This is, So what we're talking about here is it's been long in the making. There's a culture war right now around gender, which is polarizing men and women on one side who are saying, come on, have you gone mad? Is this the world you want to live in? And men and women on the other side. And let me point out they're more numerous, better funded. It's been a slow burn. This business has been going on since the 90s. The Vatican started it in Cairo, in the population conference. And they have gathered enormous momentum. The Vatican has declared that there is such a thing as gender ideology, which aims to destroy the family, make everybody gay. How, I'm not sure. And it's called gender ideology. And as you know, gender courses are being banned in Central European universities. In Latin America, I don't know, they call it, I guess, ideología del género. They've created a straw person. That doesn't exist, of course. There's no such thing. There is a sort of perspective of looking at the world from a gender lens. So I think the question of violence, I haven't been able to resolve this one. I don't understand it, I have to say.
Can I just add also to the alt-right discourses, it's about migration and demographic warfare. And if you look at of worried that the white land is going to be overpopulated by Muslims and foreigners, and it's not just people from Muslim backgrounds, but Mexicans and whoever else. And so and rape is one of the ways that tries to curtail that, is to rape. That was one of the main ideas in the Bosnian genocide as well, was to rape as many women as you can, kill as many as you can, because you're trying to stop the population from growing. And
well, that was tried in Bangladesh, as you know, a
Yeah,
long time ago. But I cannot say that I've thought this one through, because it keeps changing and taking more and more noxious forms.
Can I add to that? I mean, so I think you're right, Nitzan, and this is something, of course, that we see everywhere in the world, that we increasingly have the vocabulary. There is more attention and more spaces to name and identify gender-based violence, okay? And so often what looks like there is, all of a sudden there is gender-based violence in certain places where we didn't have it, doesn't mean that it didn't exist before, but we didn't name it. So there's certainly that dimension, but I think that's not everything. So let's take the example of Egypt. So Denise pointed to the kind of political instrumentalization of sexual violence. I'm speaking about the harassment that she mentioned, and clearly there were thugs that were hired depending on your political positioning, you know, either by the Mubarak regime or by the Muslim Brotherhood or by everyone. And so, you know, feminists, many of my feminist friends in Egypt were very much sort of pointing out, you know, that this was this politicized gender-based violence. But, you know, the fact is that on the side street, at the workplace, at the school, and at home, there were other forms of gender-based sexual violence that was not political and that existed before. In terms of just walking on the street, I mean, I think many of us who lived in Egypt before, so I lived in Cairo in the 1990s, I used to be able to walk home alone at night at 2 a.m. in the morning, and I felt safe. I wouldn't feel safe now walking on the street in Cairo during the day. So something has shifted as well. In a place like Iraq, I mean, during the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, and don't get me wrong, it was a brutal dictator, but many people left their doors open because they did not think there would be crime. And there wasn't that kind of crime. There was other crime going on. And so the gender-based violence that we saw was mainly at the hands of the state. So the son of Saddam Hussein O'Day was notorious for actually picking young women and raping them. Now, in the context of chaos and lawlessness, and also in the context of an increased militarization of society, we find the normalization of violence and the sort of continuum of violence in terms of, you know, militarized violence on the street and violence against women, and also actually violence against men who do not fit ideals of heteronormative masculinity. So there have been actually these waves of emo attacks or gay attacks against gay men. So I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah.
Thank you to all of you for this talk, for these talks, and I think the sort of way in which the changing politics in the U.S. and elsewhere kind of offers us a different perspective, I think is certainly it's been generative. And kind of continuing on that, I mean, I'm thinking about the way in which kind of popular politics allows or kind of has produced different ways for women's involvement, and I think we see that in terms of the sort of cross-gender alliances against authoritarianism that we see in Beirut and elsewhere in the images that you showed, Nadia. But I'm curious about the ways in which kind of right-wing or masculinist restorative popular politics also include women. I mean, in the U.S. context, I can think of it clearly, you know, the way from the sort of you know, kind of more mainstream Christian anti-abortion movements, but also groups like the Proud Boys and their sort of kind of women's auxiliaries. So I'm curious about if you see or the ways in which women in the Middle East are participating in kind of the masculinist restorative popular politics as well.
Good question.
Shall we take several questions? Or?
Yeah, well, if there's another question, yeah.
Okay.
So. Oh, yeah. Georgina, yes.
Thank you so much. It's been really hard to be here with everything going on back home in Lebanon the last few weeks. But one of the really heartwarming things that I've witnessed in videos that friends have been sharing is a lot of adoption of some of the slogans that the women in Sudan have been using and the women in Iraq have been using. So even if there's no like actual collaboration and it's much more spontaneous, there's been this kind of regional solidarity among women for calling for the same things pretty much. Have you had any, like from the research you've done on these case studies, have there been any attempts at any collaboration or any cross-country work towards specific policy change for women's issues? Thank you.
Do you get more? Yeah, there was one more.
Does it work? Yeah. I have a question about sort of like political futures and how you maybe think about it in relationship to like older work. So like like imagining like the sort of anti-colonial revolts and then like the post-colonial states and the role of like women's movements within those, like there's this sort of idea of politics maybe as like a progressive time, right? Like revolution is possible, there's like the potential of growth, like even if women's movements are supposed to sort of like wait for rights until the state, you know, has reached a certain point, like it's still an idea of a future that's like developmental and like progressive and goes forward. And so I'm curious like what forms of the future and like what things or what sorts of ideas women's maybe organizations or movements have now, and like revolution is not maybe on the table when like the state has collapsed, when you have these different sorts of institutional arrangements and like maybe like liberalism being the only form of power left in the world that you can imagine is like giving rights. Like what does the future look like for people? Like how do groups imagine it in a way that maybe is different from like how it could be imagined like back in the day? Yeah.
I think the question you asked is my absolute hobby horse. That's been like a lifelong obsession. And I had to revisit my positions on that, because initially I thought that however oppressive an order might be, people stay in it because they have a stake in it. And I called that the patriarchal bargain. So for very conservative women, you know, sticking to certain role brought certain benefits, like, you know, protection, you know, lifelong security and so on. But nowadays you have a politics in which women and men participate on both sides, with lots of women actively supporting, you know, anti-abortion, etc., etc., but in a highly modified context, because the contract, the gender contract, has been torn up. Take the Middle East. I mean, how many women get older in the expectations that brides will wait on them? You know, they get carers. Brothers and sisters fight over who's going to take care of the elderly parents. So the security nets offered by what I called classic patriarchy have all gone. And it has to be completely renegotiated. So what is at stake right now is no longer arrangements in the family, but a battle over governance, over the type of society. And that relates to your last question. What is the good life? Okay, so what you have there is political ideologies. Let's face it. I mean, you know, it's conversations about gender masquerading. I mean, it's conversations about regimes we want to live under, masquerading as debates about gender and the family. What is at stake is everything, basically, whether topics like sexuality and so on are going to be items for open public debate, or whether they will be ruled by theological dictates, or rather, certain interpretations of theological dictates. I mean, look at the Vatican. For years, they've been trying to take that out of the realm of civic debate and translate it into the language of virtue and sin. It's non-negotiable, okay? I mean, you can't have a conversation about abortion. Don't be silly. It's a sin, right? So it's a question of the very terrain on which these things are debated. And I personally think, and this is very controversial, too late to bring it in, really too late. And I think that some of the gender debates in the West, when translated into other countries, have made them toxic. So that somehow the nostalgic traditional family, which, alas, in practice, no longer exists. If you look at the UN report on the family, the 2019 report, it no longer exists, but this nostalgia is translated into we the people versus an elite that has these weird values and that raises gender-neutral children, excuse me. So it becomes translated into a form of popular alienation, which then feeds into populist politics. So visions for the future, I think there's a battle on. And I don't think that feminist groups are unified. I think that it's a situation of politics of coalitions, really. You know, so if you're in the Middle East and you're fighting for women's rights, you're on the back foot. How much can you ally, and to what extent can you ally with sexual liberties platforms? Huge question. You know, You would assume you have a broad coalition. Is it safe? In some contexts, I think not. So from place to place, you have to be very careful. And I personally think that this is politics, and politics involves alliances. So in a situation such as the ones you described, where you have an ascending popular movement of men and women, what are the forces that you can ally yourself with if you're a feminist? And how do you define feminism? Huge questions, yeah.
I was just going, just to add, thinking about the situation in Lebanon right now, I think it's really important to look at creative spaces where women and men are resisting this male authoritarian politics. And they're really creative in the sense, in terms of the political aesthetics of the language that's being used, the humor, the disarming poetry, the caricatures, the graffiti on the walls. There's a lot of different really interesting ways through the arts, through many of these different spaces that are dealing with local inequalities and local struggles, but they're connecting to struggles elsewhere. And Iran is a very interesting case study to see this happening for a long time now. Iran has had those spaces where really interesting things emerge. And then after that, from the whole Arab uprisings, but also the global protest movements from 2011 to 2013 that were happening from Botswana to Wisconsin to the Arab Spring or Arab uprisings, they all started to speak to each other and communicate with each other, even though they're very particular in their local context. So I think these sort of spaces are really interesting, and I think more dots are being connected, which might be a way to think about the future as well.
So in response to Alex's question, absolutely, women are very much involved in masculinist restoration. So in Iraq alone, in so many different instances I've come across it, whether it is with respect to female genital mutilation, which is actually prevalent in Iraqi Kurdistan, not in central and southern Iraq. It is actually often the mothers or the grandmothers who are more supportive and enthusiastic about reproducing this tradition than actually the fathers. Or with respect to, we also have in relation to honor-based killings. In the Iraqi parliament, there is a 25% quota enshrined in the constitution that states that any kind of executive legislative body, there should be 25% women. Well, in practice, it's not implemented, but often the women who are then actually make it to parliament or into these committees tend to be not just extremely conservative, but would have, like there was last year, a discussion by several female parliamentarians, what level of beating, the husband beating the wife is okay. So definitely this is happening, and as Denise points out, these were then also about what kind of Iraq, what kind of Islamist, what kind of sectarian Iraq. These women were very much invested in those questions. So this was part and parcel of these larger questions. In terms of Georgina's question, whether there's collaboration. To be honest, I don't know whether there is much collaboration. I think one of the problems is that there is, of course, collaboration in terms of through social media, people recognize the kinds of slogans, the kinds of activities. I suspect that beyond that, there is not that much collaboration. I think that's then also links a little bit to the question in terms of the kinds of politics and the future, that I think one of the problems that we see, and we've had that discussion before. It's a sort of ambivalence because I want to be excited and happy seeing what's happening in Lebanon and also seeing what's happening in Iraq, but I'm also very worried because I think what is much more clearly articulated is what people are against, but not so much what they're for. So that vision is kind of missing beyond very sort of general slogans of, get rid of the government, get rid of corruption, get rid of sectarianism. But beyond that, it's difficult to imagine either in the Lebanese or the Iraqi context. So what is the aftermath of getting rid of the system? And so the kind of lack of leadership, the kind of lack of organization, which on the one hand makes it so exciting and dynamic and creative and inspiring, might also be the downfall on the long run. And I guess for me the only really political movement that has been sort of more clearly in articulating an alternative vision in terms of future society, and I should say that I have actually lots of also reservations about that, but was the Kurdish political movement in terms of the sort of this idea of democratic confederalism, and sort of actually trying to put into practice a vision, which I don't really see happening elsewhere right now. Yeah. Could where's the microphone?
Thank you so much. That's just an amazing sort of, not just a regional analysis, but really a global sort of diagnosis of what's happening with gender relations and with these connections between the regime, these anti-authoritarian movements, and the gender relations is really, I think, incredibly important and really explains so much of what it just goes without saying in most sort of political analysis, right? This still is not part of a mainstream analysis of our contemporary moment. But I wonder how much of this discourse is in these movements. In other words, the focus on regime problems of corruption and so on. How much is there additionally an open discussion about the violence, and not just the physical violence, but the structural violence in which women are as much, again, disadvantaged as they are by the physical coercion. So I wonder how much of this is in the debates and out in the political part of the political process.
No. I don't want you to shut up.
I asked just in case.
You want to?
Yeah, sure, because it's such an incredibly important question, and I think that it is out there, but not maybe articulated quite in the ways you would expect. What I look at for pointers to this question is expressions in movements of resistance that are explicitly gendered. So the first clue came to me in 2009 in Iran. You remember there was a green movement, and what the government did, trying to discredit a student leader called Mohammed Tavakoli, I believe was his name. They claimed that he had fled the country dressed as a woman in a burqa. Of course, that made him a coward. The association with femininity was supposed to debase him. The result of this was that a bunch of Iranian men donned the veil, put themselves on Facebook with the caption, "We are all Majid Tavakoli." Now, there wasn't nobody was explicitly reflecting on that, but that move signaled two things. First of all, that it saw the government's move as a crude ploy to invite men in participating in the regime's repression by using the association with women. And second, a refusal to be debased by that association by becoming women. Now, none of these Iranian men were building theories about that. They just did it, basically. They went out there. Now, there was a movement in Turkey. These things are sort of, We Are Not Men, it was called, Biz Erkek Değiliz. It consisted of a bunch of men who were going around wearing really interesting attire, miniskirts, etc., holding placards saying, if killing women is being a man, then we are not men. If beating a woman is, then we are not men. And of course, you know, the power holders were furious. Who are these guys? Now, when you look at Egypt, he's talking about the solidarity movement against raping women. A lot of men participated in these grassroots protection NGOs, like the Tahrir Bodyguard, where men would go out there and, you know, work with their female counterparts to stop the thugs that were trying to molest them and rape them. Now, after Sisi came to power, and, you know, this was the ultimate masculinist restoration because he was, you know, the he-man father of the nation, they started talking about, and these guys with earrings and ponytails, I don't mean to offend anyone here, but literally they were describing a certain type of man as being beyond the pale, as it were, you know? So this language of masculinity and femininity and normative femininity and masculinity was being manipulated by power holders, as indeed Erdogan did in Turkey. What sorts of men are these? You know, referring to, you know. So I think Catherine is right, because this, what you were saying about spontaneous creative expressions, this man may not be articulated in very fancy discourse, but it erupts in the form of, shall we say, changed sensibilities. That's very important.
But I agree,
Change
obviously,
sensibilities.
but I also agree with Nadia's point of what comes next, because we got very excited about the Arab uprisings and all of the wonderful tropes and the poetry and the symbol of the tent and all the wonderful, you know, symbols that were connected around the world. But then where does it go? I think so. I do think it's really important to track and to listen to these articulations in all their forms, and to think about them and what they mean and what they're subverting in each context. But then we also have to think, what next as well? So I do take Nadia's point as well. You know?
Yes, although, I mean, I think I very much also agree with our colleague Gilbert Achkar at SOAS, who made the point on numerous occasions. And if you look at revolutions historically, they don't just happen overnight, and they don't happen in a year. And so what we see happening now is linked to what happened in 2011. And, you know, and there is a process that has been put into place. And I think we will see, you know, in the same way that patriarchy is pushing back through masculinist restoration because it's threatened and not stable, by the same token, authoritarian regimes are pushing back, and of course the two are linked closely, and because they're not stable. And for me, there is hope in the sort of new generation. I mean, to see in a place like Iraq, where literally people who grew up, you know, who now are 18, 19, 20, they only grew up in a sort of context of war, conflict, violence, and generations before also. But to, you know, to come up with ideas, no, I mean, we don't want to be shackled down by these sectarian, corrupt politicians. So, I mean, I do think that although short-term, middle-term, I'm not very hopeful. I mean, I'm still excited when I see the images, but I mean, I'm not that hopeful. But long-term, I do feel certain developments have been put into process. And but as Denise points out, that battle is going on everywhere right now. In terms of Kathy's question, I think that in some context, a kind of gendered lens or gendered politics is more central than in others. In some, it's more implicit. So in the context of Lebanon, it's much more out there because, you know, Lebanese feminists and Lebanese LGBTQ activists have had much more space prior to the recent protests to express themselves. So in that context, feminist and also LGBTQ demands are central and key and explicit as part of the wider protests. In the Iraqi context, actually feminists have been at the forefront of challenging sectarianism and authoritarianism, but in the Iraqi context, you would not be able to, for instance, engage in LGBTQ rights. I mean, that's like a total taboo. But I have seen that although initially all the slogans and the demands revolved around political corruption and sectarianism, I mean, challenging sectarianism, now demands also include greater freedom for women, and that sort of coincides with the greater presence for women. And yesterday I heard, I mean, similar to the initial phase on Tahrir Square, that there have not been instances of harassment and gender-based violence on the streets while women and men are mingling, which is quite something, because in everyday life in Iraq there has been quite lots of harassment and gender-based violence. So yes, and in the Sudanese context, I think it was actually more explicit as well. It was more explicit. I mean, yeah, the Sudanese women who were, very much leading in certain contexts were not only, I mean, their demands were gender demands as well.
But it wasn't just it wasn't just an add-on, add women to this question. It's women's problem as the problem of authoritarianism in the form of patriarchy, but that seeing this larger movement as all having the same goal in a certain very abstract sense of anti-authoritarianism.
I think probably in
Or
the
is that not-
Sudanese context and in the Egyptian context most clearly articulated, and then of course also most clearly articulated in the Kurdish movement. In the others, I would say probably more implicit.
I think in Turkey it's pretty explicit.
Yeah, in Turkey as well.
It's out there in the
Yeah.
press. I mean, you have male columnists, all saying, if this isn't solved, we'll get nowhere. You can't have a democratic society where judges, allow a rapist to walk free because she showed up in a tie and looked repentant, which is what happened regularly. He called it the love affair between the judiciary and rapists. Yeah, so it's pretty out there.
Any other questions? So actually we're at the end of our allotted time, so we can thank our guests, and the book is available outside. Thank you very, very much.